So, can you hear me? No? Yeah? Hi. So I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. Today I'm going to talk about drone pilots, humanitarians, and the video game analogy, and trying to unpack a bit of the public conversation going on. No?
Turn it on.
Yes, that helps. Used to be a lifeguard, so I'm just used to shouting. So I would like to inform you that I have received advanced forgiveness from previous speaker for using the term drone pilot. And as a humanitarian, I will also engage in a bit of soul searching as to how we talk about this. Apparently there's some issues with the first few pages, so I'll be flipping it a bit back and forth. Yeah, here. So the problem, how do we talk about the drone warfare and the drone pilots? The public-civilian conversation about war by remote control and about the role of drone pilots is quite new and quite immature. It's characterized by hype, exaggerations, and misinformation, and also by almost only US examples. On the other hand, as more and more countries are building UAV fleets, we see this kind of nationalization of the drone debate. Last year was quite exciting. It was the year of civic engagement and focus on humanitarian cost. So for example, a place like Norway, AS Norway industry group has been around for a while, but we now also have Fredslaget, which is sort of this anti-drone activist group. And I think a lot of the same is playing out in other countries. And also last year, Square focused on living under the drone stare and living with sort of these things hovering above. Particularly important reports from Stanford and Human Rights Watch. Yep. So, debating UAV and the future of war. I agree with Peter Singer, something is changing. It's not, we don't need to talk about revolution in military technology, but something is really changing, and we need to discuss this. So, there is a responsibility for understanding. That is the public's. That would be the responsibility of people like me as a humanitarian scholar. How do we make sense of this? But it's also the responsibility of being understood, and that's yours. You need to make yourself understood. You need to explain what you're doing, you need to justify what you're doing, and you need to communicate with the civil society. So, overview of presentation, because my starting point is sort of the role the video game analogy plays in this conversation. First, I will be evaluating the idea of drone pilots as gamers. Who are they? What do they do? And then looking at the key ideas underpinning this video game analogy. This surgical precision idea, and this distance dehumanization nexus. And then finally, I'd be doing a little soul searching, thinking about how humanitarians talk, specifically looking at this very unfortunate bug splat metaphor, which seems irresistible for a number of activists. So, central to the public understanding of UAV, analogy between war and gaming, and something I would have to describe as moral ambiguity surrounding the drone pilot status as pilot and or gamer. The public is a little uneasy about this. So, there are pedagogical challenges. Military, the politicians, the humanitarian community, we all use the video game analogy. And clearly, the media loves the video game analogy. What does it mean? How is it used? Is it useful? And does terminology really matter? I think previous speakers have already answered that question. Yes, to you, terminology really matters. The question is, does it really matter to the rest of us? And I was explaining to somebody I talked to that when the public thinks about the drone, they're not thinking about what you guys were operating with 15 years ago. When the public think about the drone today, they think about a Reaper, whatever that means. So, the activist community, they like this analogy. Killing by remote control. This author seems to be describing some kind of UAV-initiated genocide going on across the globe. This is one sort of very extreme way of writing about this. And then you have other actors using this. Couldn't resist this. I mean, he's yours. This is Prince Harry fighting the Taliban with his Apache helicopter. It's a joy for me. And then once I've actually used this example, I realized that he's actually not using this as an analogy. But as I said, it's used by many people. The drone pilot, brief biography. Here, popular perceptions in the media and used by the human rights community. The drone pilot is portrayed as caught in this kind of dual crisis of masculinity. He's looked upon by real pilots, US Air Force culture wars, for not flying real airplanes in war zones. I mean, yesterday somebody said that UAV pilots didn't smell sweat and blood, I think. And presumably the thought would be that they smelled waffles, so maybe we're all set for some Norwegian culture wars. But the public also kind of suspect that the drone pilot engages in this potentially illegal activity where playing war engenders real killing and possibly of civilians. There's a lot of doubt out there. Here. And now, these are some public and humanitarian non-perceptions. These things are not on the radar, and I think you need to know this. Cost. People have this idea that drones are extremely cheap, and usually they're contrasted with these very expensive real planes. And so, war is made cheap and easy. And the dangerous thing is if politicians start thinking this, that war will be cheap and easy. There's very little understanding of technology and how it's changing. These two are different things. Automatization and autonomy, they're not the same. There is really no understanding of the size and organization of a combat air patrol required for flying and keeping things up in the air and making sense of what is observed. And it seems like the pilot's just sitting here with his little joystick, but there are complex decision-making processes and the content of ROE and so on and so forth. The public doesn't know about these things at all. And I think maybe culturally, maybe the most sort of important factor, there is a cultural mythology of fighter pilots as one-man shows, although that, of course, we know is not real. This is the pilot as Tom. This was the kind of most dorky picture I could find of Tom Cruise online. So the drone pilot would be Tom with braces, but doing it all by himself. This is what the public thinks, and this, as we know, is not accurate. UAV piloting is a new career. Here are some very non-gamer style facts. As we've seen, complicated recruitment history, experienced and new pilots cross-training from manned airframe, and non-pilot commissioned officers working together, voluntary and involuntarily. So we have doubts over the necessity of real pilot skills, but still there are no promotion rates. I mean, these are difficult things for kind of a emergent professional identity. Particularly interesting, there's this whole new alliance between conservative fighter pilots joined by liberal, very left US media in denouncing medals for drone pilots. No bravery or risk involved. And here, Air Force Major Blair strikes back and comparing the 9/11 Pentagon attack to the possible risk run by RPA operators. And I think this is interesting. Who knows whether this is true or not? But it's also this quite fascinating alliance between sort of the conservatives and the liberals. There's been some attention to the workday, and particularly the PSTD, combat stressors, killing civilians or friendly ground forces by accident, this continuous exposure to live video feeds and images, and maybe most significant, this professional-private divide. Previous speakers said that they required of their pilots to go into combat mode when they came in the door in the morning. So you're going into combat mode when you come in the door, but you're going to have to leave your combat mode when you go out the door and drive home to the suburbs, pick up your kids, pay the rent, and do the dishes. In addition, shift work, might it actually make it difficult to sustain that kind of everyday routine? So the question is, this is recent research, operational stresses, are they really more central? Long hours, shift work, bad ergonomics, you sit. I didn't mean to say awful, but undesirable work locations. So these are all things that the public is ignorant of. Maybe you want to get these things, on the table. Or just bored. Interesting MIT study from last year, finding that humans are effectively babysitting automation, leading to a problem of boredom. Citing a study where 92% of pilots reported moderate to total boredom. But the consequences are serious. The consequences are very serious, missed alerts. It should be mentioned that this study also found that you could organize the work differently. Their top performers in the simulation study were people who actually kind of multitasked and did different things. And I don't mean eating more Doritos or going to the bathroom more often, but sort of people who divided their work a little differently. And then I just want to disagree with my fellow legal scholar yesterday, who said that drones, I think, don't do stupid things. They can't get frustrated and act silly, but human beings still can. People who are overworked, underappreciated, ill-trained, tired, frustrated, and so on and so forth. The drone or the UAV is not, it's technology, but it's not going to save you from staff problems. Yes. So, challenge is identifying the right stuff. What makes a great fighter pilot is not what makes a great UAV pilot. There are problems with retaining staff, while more staff is needed. So how do you identify the right stuff? What kind of cognitive abilities and personal traits and moral motivation would you be looking for? The gamer or the classical pilot? A mix of both? I think this is unclear. I would also like to put on the table the idea that this would depend on national culture. So far, the drone pilot is an American, but the drone pilot of tomorrow will have many nationalities and come from many different cultural traditions. Yes. That was the short biography of the drone pilot as gamer. And now I'll be moving to a discussion of analogy between war and game, or computer games. So, is killing like gaming, or is gaming like killing? The public tends to think these things. These are individuals who've grown up playing computer games, and this is what they're going to keep doing. And then there's this seamless and quite odd transition into accepting that combat is now done through computer training, and combat itself actually looks like computer games. I think it's an important job that you guys need to do to make sure the public understands this. This is a very complicated task. Civilians will die. You will also lose troops, and you will bring back wounded veterans. These things they're going to change a bit, but they're not completely going to change. Warfare and gaming are two different activities. But surgical precision. Mentioned by a number of previous presenters, that the drone is precise. It has de facto accuracy. Now I sound very much like an academic talking about this. Just saying that the dominant political military rationale for the drone wars is the notion that there's this drone stare that enables operators to see, strike, or reach everything with surgical precision. And the idea, at least as presented to the public, is that this lessens human suffering. But then we know civilian casualties, friendly fire deaths, technical mishaps. It doesn't much help to see this IED buried in the road if you can't communicate through the radio. And then there's a problem of interpreting and communicating what you hear with your team. And then, of course, loss of aircraft. And then I just went down to the hall and saw one of these students who'd written about Grossman's book. Yes, very, very influential in thinking about drone wars. Grossman argues that distance, and this is of course before UAVs really became the big new thing, but still, he claims that distance is recognized as fundamental to the way you can dehumanize people. And if you can do this efficiently, you can kill more easily. And he talks about mechanical distance, the screen that separates the gamer from the game. What separates the drone pilot from people on the ground or the conflict on the ground. A lot of people disagree with Grossman. One perspective actually sees distance as better. I'm not scared, I'm not stressed, I can control my decisions, I can be more rational, I can actually take out fewer civilians or fewer wrong targets. Different critique goes more to the analogy per se. They are really not the same. Games, discontinuous, you can reset, you can pause, while UAV video feeds entail more continuous immersion. Distinction and identification of terrorists, very self-evident in video games, not so in real life. Although as a civilian, I have to say that this idea of signature strike as identifying any male of military age in the company of an identified legitimate target, it is quite problematic. And then the legal and moral implications of collateral damage. It's real. Real humans are involved as troops and as civilians and as victims. So, what he says, I find this quite interesting to think about. So, the whole idea of distance, physical distance and psychological distance, it collapses. It actually makes you closer. And according to this view, it's not the kind of intimacy where you're following this Afghan family and their routines and it becomes difficult to pull the trigger because you've seen that they're good dads. It's intimacy as a form of comradeship, force protection, desire for professional acceptance. And pulling the trigger is not difficult. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear more about this from people who have practiced themselves. I mean, these are a couple of different academic perspectives. Now I've gotten almost to the end of my talk. This is the bug splat. Controversies over casualty counts are quite well known by now. Long War Journal, the New American Foundation, and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, they compete over who has the best counting, getting quite upset with each other. Less focus has been given to the use of terminology by humanitarian critics. The bug splat, I think, is one use that's very unfortunate. So, talking fast about the bug splat. Quick Google on this. Referred to as a form of military slang for a man killed by a drone strike. As the official term used by US authorities when humans are killed by drone missiles. Or as example of perverted potential of video game analogy. There's even a children's computer game of the same name. What I don't like about this metaphor is that then, naturally, the critics proceed to compare the bug splat to how the Hutus described the Tutsis as cockroaches. And then going back to the Second World War and the Germans' idea of pests to be exterminated. And I think that is very unhelpful and very unnecessary and very irresponsible. The problem is also that it builds on kind of a wrong idea of what the bug splat is. And it wouldn't be very difficult to find out. 2003, Washington Post describes this recently approved bug splat program as kind of a war planning tool. And as noted by Noel Sharkey in 2008, the bug splat software and its successors have been used to help calculate the correct bomb to use to destroy a target and calculate the impact. I mean, I don't like this. I didn't like the Iraq War, but this is not the kind of bug splat you saw in the previous slide. I really think we need to be better at talking about this. Maybe we should, get rid of the term drone pilot. Maybe you're right. But we can't, as responsible partners in a discussion, we should get rid of terms like the bug splat. So, conclusion. As I think I've showed you now, the video game analogy is used by a lot of people with a different content and for different purposes. So I think it's kind of has a limited use for almost everyone. And things are getting a lot more complicated. For example, technological developments such as wide area aerial surveillance and the need for large PD teams will be increasingly important to warfare. How can we talk about that? How should we understand the legal implications? How should we discuss this publicly with politicians and decision makers? So I think humanitarians must take better care, including myself, to understand military terminology. We must understand more about software and algorithms. And we must be able to think about more people than the drone pilot. And then, as public conversations about UAV in Norway will continue to be more frequent, what should you be doing? That is up to you, I think. Thank you.